Hi, good afternoon or good night from wherever you're joining us. Welcome and thank you for joining us at this distinguished open lecture by Professor Emerita Alma Harris, who is a professor of educational leadership and policy at Swansea University School of Education and Wales. Professor Harris' presentation is on future education, what's next. I'm Professor Nila Badri, and I am the chair of the Open Lectures Committee at the University of the West Indies, at the Augustine Campus, Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, West Indies. I acknowledge the presence online of the Doctor and the Honorable Minister of Education, Dr. Nayan Gatsby-Dolly, Professor Brian Copeland, Chancellor and Campus Principal of UB St. Augustine, our distinguished featured speaker, Professor Emerita Alma Harris, as I said before, Professor of Leadership and Policy at Swansea University School of Education, Wales, Dr. Freddie James, member of the Open Lectures Committee and Deputy Dean of Graduate Studies, Research, Humanities, Education. Also acknowledge the presence of members of the management of the University of the West Indies throughout the various campuses in the Caribbean, staff and students presented throughout the Caribbean, various stakeholders, colleagues and friends and family of Professor Harris, our special invited guests, the public, and members of the media. Thank you for joining us at this distinguished lecture. As I mentioned before, it is on future-proofing education, what's next. This lecture will consider the impact of COVID-19 education systems around the world. The prime aim of identifying the possibilities and priorities of education systems in the future. According to the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, assessment impact estimates that over 1.5 billion students in 165 countries are out of school due to COVID-19 pandemic. As we struggle to curb the pandemic, the whole academic community is forced to cope and explore new ways of teaching and learning, including distance and online education and distributed leadership. Technology is being used to support and benefit the education and learning sector. To address this afternoon, we are delighted to have the Honorable Nayan Gatsby-Dolly, Minister of Education of the Republic of Tobago. This is a pre-recording.
Professor Nila Badri, Chair of the Open Lectures Committee, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. Professor Brian Copeland, Prof, Vice Chancellor and Campus Principal of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine Campus. Professor Emerita Alma Harris, Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy, Swansea University School of Education, Wales. Dr. Freddie James, member of the Open Lectures Committee and Deputy Dean, Graduate Studies and Research, Faculty of Humanities and Education, UB. UB officials of the various regional campuses, staff and students of the UB. Colleagues, friends and family of Professor Harris, specially invited guests, members of the media, speakers and stakeholders, ladies and gentlemen. I am deeply honored to address you at this distinguished lecture by Professor Emerita Alma Harris of the Swansea University, Wales. And the topic is Future-Proofing Education. What's next? Allow me to begin by commending the Open Lectures Committee of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine Campus, for initiating this important discourse on the future of education. It is timely, relevant and required in normal times, and therefore even more so during this pandemic, which has stretched into 2022. The government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago's guiding policy document, Vision 2030, highlights the need for a modern, relevant and accessible education and training system, the realization of which requires the support of and collaboration with all stakeholders. The The objective is to provide an adequately trained workforce to satisfy the developmental needs and trajectory of this small but ambitious nation. It is that ambition and determination for regional leadership and international relevance that has led the Ministry of Education to consider the current crisis as an accelerant for long-needed change. A catalyst for a first world country requires first world citizens with world-class education. This is non-negotiable. This therefore requires us as a nation to plan and execute, bearing in mind that our plans of today must be adaptable to a future which, if possible, is even more unpredictable than we had ever imagined. What we know, however, is that any component of this plan must involve the resilience and robustness that digital operations provide, and therein lies the basis for the relentless thrust towards achieving the digital transformation paradigm, a state described as one of perpetual agility, ready for constant evolution. Where others may have long gone, we in Trinidad and Tobago now go, undaunted by what can be considered our late entry into this digital space, and buoyed by our decision to view this positively. We have many good examples to follow. So here we are, establishing our Educational Technology Department at the Ministry of Education. Here we are, institutionalizing an organized nationwide school learning management system. Here we are, populating our education management information system, procuring an e-book platform. This is where we are. Training our teachers in the use of online resources and to create open educational resources which are relevant to and suitable for our population. Here we are in the year of our Lord 2022, in the midst of a pandemic, the catalyst, the accelerant. As we sit at the world's feet, applying their learnings to our present context, the value of distinguished experience cannot be overstated. Therefore, we thank the UE for this opportunity to have Professor Emerita Alma Harris share with us today. On a personal note, in the year 2000, I spent 3 months at the Swansea University as I studied towards my doctorate in chemistry under the distinguished Professor Andrew Pelton. Therefore, I receive you, Professor Harris, with a flood of warm, pleasant memories, as well as the academic respect accorded to a professional of your eminence. I await the feature presentation with much anticipation, eager to add valuable advice to the pot from which we in Trinidad and Tobago will draw knowledge for the future. I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. And that's the Dolly, Minister of Education of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. It is quite enlightening to be informed of so many initiatives in educational technology Vision 2050 program. To introduce Professor Alma Harris and to bring opening remarks on behalf of the University of the West Indies, the Augustine Campus, I would like to invite Vice Chancellor and Campus Principal. Welcome, Professor Copeland.
Thank you, Professor Badri, and to the Honorable Nyan Gasby-Dolly, Minister of Education of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and to you, Chair of the Open Lectures Committee, Professor Nila Badri, to our featured speaker, Emeritus Professor Alma Harris, Dr. Freddie James, Deputy Dean of Graduate Studies and Research at the Faculty of Humanities and Education here at the St. Augustine Campus of the University of the West Indies, members of the Open Lectures Committee, UE staff and students, members of the media. And of course, welcome to all our guests here this afternoon. I saw people dialing in from Turkey, from Barbados, from Wales. Welcome to everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here on a Sunday afternoon, or if you are like Professor Emerita Harris, a Sunday evening, or like others on a Sunday night, because our topic is of critical importance and our speaker, both knowledgeable and experienced in this field of study. Now, you'll agree that the pandemic has been a supremely disruptive force. And if you add to that a war in Europe, and you can see that we're all once again driven by an urgency to race against a ticking clock for survival and long-term success. And once again, we must acknowledge that it is always the most vulnerable, the youngest, the oldest, the weakest, who suffer most grievously. There is no doubt that empowerment for survival is, as I've always claimed, at the very heart of an effective national educational system. I have said elsewhere that the COVID-19 disruption has led to adaptation, and by spurring necessary change, has caused us here at the University of the West Indies to fast track the improvements that we have made in online learning and virtual work, improvements that will serve us long after our current crises have passed. But what else should we be doing as regional and global governments, as administrators, teachers, parents, and other interested parties, including mental wellness advocates? In the lecture that we will hear a few minutes from now, Professor Emerita Alma Harris will consider the impact of COVID-19 on education systems around the world and identify the possibilities and priorities for our education systems in the future. She will seek to highlight international trends generated in response to COVID-19 and speak to the educational and other related issues that have arisen because of this pandemic. Her presentation will consider the very questions we're asking ourselves. What's next for education systems as they emerge from these challenging times, locally, regionally, and globally? How can we proactively prepare? It is my expectation that this lecture will help us hone our focus on what matters most for those of us leading and working within education systems. From the perspective of developing states within the Caribbean, what are the important steps we must take to future-proof the learning of young people in our schools? As you will see, Professor Emerita Alma Harris, Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy at Swansea University School of Education in Wales, is eminently placed to provoke thought and discussion on this issue. Her professional CV, which is much too long to relate in full here, demonstrates her proven commitment to equity and excellence in education. Professor Harris is a consultant to the World Bank and a past president of the International Congress for School Effectiveness. Among other career achievements, she has served as International Education Advisor to the First Minister of Scotland, as Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of Bath, and Director, Institute of Educational Leadership at the University of Malaya. She is internationally known for her research and writing on school leadership and system improvement. Her latest book, System Recall, Leading for Equity and Excellence in Education, was published by Colin in 2020. Professor Harris serves on the Council of the Learned Society Wales and was a member of the Independent Review of Qualifications 2020 in Wales. Most recently, she chaired an independent review of leadership for the Welsh Government. Ladies and gentlemen, let us sit back, relax, and welcome Professor Emerita Alma Harris to speak on the topic, Future-Proofing Education, What's Next? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, that kind introduction. I'm just trying to find the right slides. If you bear with me for just 30 seconds, and hopefully, okay. Right, okay. So, good evening, everyone from Wales in the UK, where it is neither sunny nor warm, unlike being in the West Indies. Although one of the participants did say, very envious of this, that they were in Barbados and it was slightly windy. So I'm speaking to you from an evening in Wales, and where it isn't sunny at all. It's a huge privilege to be able to give this open lecture, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you tonight. And Professor Nila Badri, the chair of the Open Lecture Series, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for inviting me to do this. Professor Brian Copeland, Vice Chancellor, again, a very eloquent introduction for which many thanks. And I think you've already raised a few things that I will raise in my lecture tonight. And I like the idea of empowerment for survival, because I think in many respects we are certainly in that ballpark. And I'm also very delighted that Dr. Freddie James has joined us. And Freddie James was my PhD student when I was at the University of Warwick, longer than I care to remember. And it's an absolute delight that he is joining us this evening and will be asking me some questions later on. In terms of the title of this lecture, Future-Proofing Education, What's Next? I guess the question is, can we ever future-proof anything? And what COVID has done quite dramatically, it's sort of raised the stakes on what we can physically do to future-proof education. It's also, I think, I highlighted a number of things that we took for granted. I think the stability of education over many decades, the conservative nature of education with a small c, and the predictability of education was just completely and utterly thrown apart by COVID. That was the unexpected. That's what we never ever anticipated would happen. And today, 2 years ago today, in fact, schools in Wales closed for the first time, and they have remained closed, and they've opened again, and they've gone back to being closed. And I guess that's a very familiar pattern in many countries around the world. And I know that in the West Indies, schools are operating now in a hybrid way. And I think that's also the case in many other countries where technology is now supporting learning, and also we've got face-to-face learning. And I'll say a little bit about that and the benefits of that, and some of the, I guess, the negatives of that a little later on. With 1.5 billion young people out of schooling, the consequences of that have been catastrophic, and it's very catastrophic for the most vulnerable learners. And you heard the Minister of Education talking about, the most vulnerable young people, and the need to focus on equity in order to get through this next phase, whatever this next phase looks like, and no one has a blueprint about that. So in this lecture, what I'm going to share, I guess, are some ideas. They may already be familiar to you, but I think it's important to map out some of the things that we've learned from COVID, to think about the future and what we might do differently now as a result of COVID, and how we strengthen our education systems, whether we're in the West Indies, whether we're in Wales, whether we're in England, whether we're in Canada, whether we're in Spain. The same basic questions are there. How do we ensure that young people from every setting, whatever their background, get the best education possible? Because disruption, as we've seen in the Ukraine, is very unpredictable, and therefore we cannot just assume that things will go back to the way they were. In so many respects, I wouldn't advise that we go back to the way we were, because we've learned so much through this pandemic. And I'll also say a little bit about the things we've learned, as well as some of the things that we've lost. But it seems to me that the only way to really look forward and to learn forward is to look back and think about the pandemic, to think about the negatives, to think about some of the positives, but also to think about, you know, what we have learned, because our education systems have learned a great deal, because most education systems around the world have kept operating despite some of the greatest challenges we've ever experienced. And I think our teachers and our school leaders, they need to be commended for the work that they've done and the pressures that they've faced in simply keeping our schools functioning and keeping our young people actually learning. So I think that's the important point that I want to make first of all, is that we can only really plan forward by looking backwards, not to think about the good old days and what was then, but to think about what we've learned and upon which we can now build better or build for the future. And as your Minister of Education said, that is now the priority, to think about what we've learned, how we build better, and to move forward in a way that is both principled but supports both equity and excellence. The context of schooling has shifted dramatically. I don't need to say that to you. You will have experienced it. You will know it if you have children in school, if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, you will know this, and you will understand the degree to which that context has shifted. And this article, written with Michelle Jones, it's a very short article, and it really tried to outline some of the things that school leaders were actually facing during the most disruptive of times, because in a way, our school leaders have been at the very, very forefront of keeping our schools functioning, keeping our schools open, and they've borne the greatest brunt, I think, along with teachers and support staff, of this wave of the pandemic. So I'll come back to this article at the end, because I want to really return to one quote, which I think still really is very apposite, given the challenges that we're facing and given the way we're trying to rebuild schooling and to build it back better. A couple of things to just start with, really, and that's COVID-19 and the point that this was a perfect storm. No one could have predicted this. It happened so quickly, so dramatically. There was so much uncertainty. If I think back 2 years ago, it was actually quite frightening, because you were caught up, as you all well know, in a situation where it was hard to see a way forward. We've never closed schools in Wales. You know, you've probably never had that situation in the West Indies and in other countries. So this was an absolute perfect storm with imperfect responses. And that's the important thing to recognize, is no one had the blueprint, no one had the plan. Everybody was trying their level best through ingenuity, through innovation, through collaboration, to come up with some responses. But inevitably, they were imperfect. And in many respects, they were partial, because the pace of change was so quick, so dramatic, so unpredictable. It's almost like being caught up in a tornado and not understanding which way is up. That's what COVID-19 felt like, not just for education systems, but for our health systems, our social care systems. This was a perfect storm. And the point absolutely come again, which is the important reason why we must learn from COVID-19. This isn't just a moment in time that has passed. This is something that could reoccur. And therefore, we have to make sure that we have the barriers in place, the fortitude in place to weather whatever storm comes next. Our school leaders, who did a magnificent job right across the world, were walking on a tightrope without a safety net. That's what one school leader described to me, how it felt to be in school on a daily basis, not knowing what was going to face him, not knowing what's going to face the school or the community. And that sort of sense of imbalance, I think, captures COVID so perfectly. And in the final point here, there were no books. I mean, if you go into any airport, if you're lucky enough to travel, you'll see lots of books on leadership, Some of them good, some of them not so good. But the point is, there was not a book that said how to lead in a pandemic. It just didn't exist. So suddenly here we were with leaders with no precedents, no guides, no ring binders, nothing to help them move forward, apart from their community, their colleagues, and their absolute sense of moral purpose, which I'll come to at the end of my talk. So here in a way is what I want to talk about in this lecture this evening. I want to talk about the challenges and the opportunities during COVID, because I think it's really important to map those out and to get that terrain right. It's not all doom and gloom. A lot of stress absolutely occurred during COVID, but there was also a lot of learning, a lot of new things, a lot of coping mechanisms, a lot of crisis management. I mean, I guess the second question is, have schools really changed, so dramatically during COVID? And if so, in what ways? And then I guess the final question is, can we future-proof education? I mean, I'm not going to say that I've got all the answers here. And I'm not going to say that we absolutely future-proof education against any further disruption, whatever that may be. But I think there are things that we can do and things that we can put in place that'll give it a much better basis to cope with the things that might come our way in the future. I want to return to this question of equity, because there's 1.5 billion young people who are out of school. Most of them were living in disadvantaged contexts. They didn't have access to the internet. They weren't privileged enough to have the sort of technical kit that schools suddenly needed and young people suddenly needed to learn. So they suddenly became disenfranchised and doubly disadvantaged because they were already living in poverty and now they were disenfranchised from learning, which, as we know, is the most powerful antidote to poverty and the effects of that on learning. So COVID-19 in many ways, I mean, we knew the inequities in our education system. They exist in every education system. No one is immune from this. The effects of poverty, disadvantage, deprivation, just the barriers to young people's learning. But what COVID-19 did was it shone a really clear spotlight on those inequities in a way that hadn't really been emphasized before. I mean, people write about equity, I write about equity. Other countries, really want an equitable system. But suddenly here we were. And from now on, we cannot ignore the spotlight that COVID-19 has shone on inequality and inequity. Some children didn't have access to the internet. Well, everything was online. So what did they learn? Well, the answer was very little. Now, as we move forward, we're in a hybrid situation. So these young people have got to have access to the internet. They've got to have access to technology. And in many ways, that's got to be a priority. If we're leveling up, a technological leveling up is what we should be focusing upon. Otherwise, you've got whole generations of young people that are going to be left behind through no fault of their own. So this must be a priority for education systems in the future if they are future-proof. Technological capability in our schools, in our communities, that will help these young people to really connect with a brand new learning world, because this is what we have. So equity is a central challenge, I think, for every education system going forward. The other things I think we know, if you think about the students themselves, and if we think about the students who had to suddenly flip from being in a classroom with a teacher, with their friends, into working in splendid isolation, if they could, in a bedroom or a kitchen, or even somewhere else in the household. Now that disconnect with their friends, and let's be honest, we've all experienced screen fatigue when you've been online on Zoom again and again. And that fatigue, of course, is multiplied for young people who will get apathetic and bored with just listening to someone talking, because there's no connection. This technology is wonderful. I'm talking to you all over the world, hopefully. But the point is, there's no connection with me. There's no way of talking to me after the lecture. There's no way of having a coffee with me. This is it. This is the two-dimensional Alma Harris. Well, as we move into a three-dimensional world again, we have to recognize that connectivity and collaboration are the most important attributes to future-proof our education systems. The other thing is, young people were really subjected, because we were learning. I mean, at universities, we were learning as well, to a pretty poor digital diet. It was pretty boring, pretty repetitive. And yet they had to sit there for endless hours upon hours, trying to engage in ways that they'd never been prepared for. Now, those challenges have translated themselves into other sorts of issues, which I will touch upon. And of course, there have been challenges for adults as well. We've been learning and working in the same space as young people, as our spouses, and that's been challenging, to be in a house, in a home all day, and that's your workspace, that's your learning space, that's your entertainment space. That's hugely challenging, as well as being a teacher and a parent and a carer, and being responsible for supporting the learning of young people, particularly when they're online for hours and hours a day, and you, in fact, may be online for hours and hours a day. So these challenges are real. I would say these challenges have improved over the period of 2 years, because I think we've been smarter and cleverer with technology. We've got very used to the virtual environment. Young people have adapted, and their adaptability is, of course, huge to being online or in a hybrid situation. But it still doesn't compensate for being face to face. I miss my students. I miss being in a lecture theatre with students asking me questions, rather than seeing blank screens and wondering if you're actually just talking to yourself. You hope not, but there's a real possibility you might be. So let me take you back to our school leaders. And in many respects, there's been a huge amount of pressure in the system. I mean, all education systems during COVID were just like a pressure cooker, and everybody was stressed. Everybody was trying to make sense of the environment they were currently living in. Everyone was frightened and scared of what they were seeing on the news. And I think for our school leaders, there was incredible pressure on them as the leaders of an organization. And that translated itself sometimes into emotional stress. And I think the one thing we cannot fail to acknowledge and accept is the emotional toll that COVID-19 has taken on all of us. We've all suffered in some ways. Some have lost family members, some have been separated for huge amounts of time. We've never been under that sort of emotional stress in education or in society ever before, I would suggest, other than in periods of war where things were unpredictable, uncertain, and very fearful. This was almost like that. We were at war against a pandemic, and on a daily basis, the news we received was sort of helping us get through, but also was placing quite a lot of emotional stress on where we were. So this takes me to well-being, and I think the big challenge for us as we move forward in education systems and in society, and of course the latest news on the Ukraine doesn't help, because suddenly we have a new crisis to think about. So the well-being of young people, the well-being of parents, adults, carers, the well-being of society, I think, is now a major issue as we hopefully come out of the pandemic. This is the number one priority in terms of you need a healthy society to get an equitable society. If you're a young person and you're vulnerable, you're hungry, you're uncertain, you don't feel cared for, it's really hard to learn. And it's the same for adults. If you feel, there are issues around your well-being, it's quite hard to step up every day and face some of the challenges that COVID presented. Now, we know, of course, on a very positive side, that there's been huge amounts of personal resilience. You know, let's be honest, we've got through this. We've got through this, and we've got through it together. And the resilience that young people have shown, adults have shown, and governments have shown, and teachers have shown has been huge. And I don't want to deny that. But in a way, you know, resilience, you can only live so far on resilience. You know, after a while, it will take a toll. So that brings me to the 3 points at the end of this list. And the one I've talked about already, the importance of equity. You know, when I do my lectures around the world, I talk about equity as being about success for every child in every setting. And sometimes people say, well, that's not achievable, Alma. You know, we know the ravages of disadvantage and deprivation on educational attainment and achievement. And yes, we do. But if we don't subscribe to success for every child, and I mean every child, in every setting, in every context, then we're actually saying it's okay for some young people to fail. And my own view is that is unacceptable. I'd rather look at success for every child in every setting than accept that some young people are just not going to get their goals and not going to get, you know, their talents rewarded in the way that we want. The two things we've learned, I think, learn the importance of family and community. You know, schools, our best schools, have always reached out to their communities. The community is part of the school is part of the community. But during COVID times, the school needed family and community more than ever, because that was its support system. That was its ecosystem that gave it the daily support to get through. And we saw in all sorts of incredible ways, the ways in which communities supported schools, you know, just to keep schools open, just to keep young people fed. You know, there was an enormous drive during COVID-19. And I think that's something we should not lose. The importance of community, the importance of the school being part of the community, and also being a resource for the community. And then very finally, I think the other message is that I think we've seen some dramatically changing leadership practices. I think, and I wouldn't want this quoted, but I think in a way, a lot of what was written before COVID-19 about leadership is probably not relevant any longer, because the world has changed, the world has shifted on its axis. So suddenly we're asking the question, well, can we go back to the old leadership practices? And yes, some are probably still relevant, but overall, we've seen a shift in leadership practices that are more distributed, more collaborative, more community focused. And that's, I think, what we should be investing in. And that's what will take us to future-proof education. The one thing I find a bit challenging is this whole discourse of learning loss. And I think that, yes, of course, as I said earlier, there has been some loss in learning. We can't deny that. Whichever country we're in, young people just haven't been able to progress at the rates that they might have progressed before because of the interruption of COVID. I think we completely accept that. But that learning loss discourse for me is a little bit negative. And I think that while we might accept that, we also need to accept that there have been learning gains. You know, we have learned such a lot during COVID that it would be such a shame to have the dominant discourse or the historical record to be one of loss, when in fact, we've learned a lot about technological engagement, we've learned a lot about different forms of leadership, we've learned a lot about community engagement, we've learned a lot about our systems actually, simply through being in COVID. So that deficit notion, and it's all about a learning loss, I'd like to challenge that and say, well, actually, let's focus on the learning gains. Let's see what schools have learned through this period and the good things that they've learned. Let's build upon those things, and let's not try and focus too much on the deficit. Young people are very adaptable, very resilient, and very able. And I think, you know, we will now move out of this period, and the notion of catch-up, I guess, is another slightly pejorative term. But certainly young people, I think, are beginning to learn in different ways and becoming comfortable with learning in those different ways. I guess I want to go back to this issue of well-being, because we have to face the brutal facts, and the brutal facts are that for young people, COVID has been an incredibly difficult time, not just for those young people in the most disadvantaged context, but I think for all young people, you know, working in splendid isolation away from their peers. It's been hard, really, really hard. And I guess what the global evidence base says is that this is still ongoing, that just because we've come out of COVID doesn't mean that everything is fine. In fact, the converse is true. I think the issue of well-being is one of the major challenges, along with equity, that we have to face, and we have to give more support to young people now and equip them to learn in this new way of learning. We can't just sweep well-being under the carpet, you know, something that a few young people have experienced. All young people, to different degrees, have had challenges with their mental health and their well-being. So this is the elephant in the living room. This is what we should be addressing, I think, and really prioritizing in our education systems, so our young people are well enough to learn. It's as simple and as complex as that. So moving forward then, what should be the priorities? Have these changed because of COVID, or have we simply consolidated what the priorities should be? And how do we and can we future-proof education? I think that's where this next part of the lecture is going to go. This is a book with Michelle Jones, and I think the Vice Chancellor mentioned this, and it's called System Recall, and it's about equity and excellence in education. And I think our first priority to future-proof education is to recognize that excellence actually comes through equity. Equity is not just a byproduct of excellence. You only get excellent systems through every child in every setting learning, and learning in the optimum way. So I think that would be my number one priority. Let's future-proof the system so that equity is the main driver, and that every young person gets a chance at a great future, whether they're in the West Indies or Wales or wherever. I think unless you prioritize equity, unless it's at the heart of the system, it becomes very hard to achieve. So that's my first big message, is about equitable education that gets us excellence. And of course, we've got systems around the world that demonstrate that that is perfectly possible. Second point I've already raised is to prioritize well-being. And that's well-being of our students, that's well-being of our staff in schools and elsewhere in the system. But also I'm going to say well-being of yourself. And that's quite a hard thing to say, because as adults, we're supposed to be coping with everything that COVID has thrown at us. But what we've learned from talking to many head teachers, many teachers, is that their well-being has also suffered. And therefore prioritizing, compassion for themselves has to be, the first priority. So here we've got a priority around well-being. If the system isn't well enough to learn, it's not well enough to deliver learning. And this takes me to the third priority. Now, I know in the West Indies, your schools are already operating on hybrid learning models, and I think that's a huge credit, because it's a very difficult thing to get right. And I like the title of this book. Why do I need a teacher when I've got Google? And that's a very good question, actually. You can learn everything on Google. You can learn everything you need to know, it seems to me. But here's the thing. In this environment that I'm talking to you now, if you're in a school, a teacher would know your name, a teacher would know your family, a teacher would be able to put their hand on your shoulder and talk to you personally. Google can't do that. And I don't think Google can ever do that. It can never, ever replace the human connection between teachers and students, which is, of course, the most important thing. I mean, knowledge, you can put knowledge onto a Google page or onto a web page, but it will never, ever replace the teacher. So I guess as we look forward to hybrid learning, we need to recognize the importance of the teacher, and the importance of teaching. So here's the thing, the pandemic has shown us categorically that no education system in the world, whether it's the West Indies, whether it's Wales, whether it's Scotland, whether it's Canada, can ever outperform the quality of its leaders in schools and the quality of its teachers. So think about that. Any education just can't outperform the quality of the teachers and the leaders in our schools. So if we're going to really improve our education systems, if we're really going to future-proof our education systems, it's clear we have to invest in the quality of our teachers and in the quality of our leaders. I think it's also really important to recognize the importance of that human connection. Ultimately, education is all about human connections. There's a bit of knowledge thrown in and some skills, but ultimately, if you think about a teacher that's influenced you, it wasn't about how good they were in teaching geography, it was how they made you feel. It was that personal connection with you. So that's what we must never lose as we move into a more technologically based education system. We must recognize that the human connection is the most important connection. So here's my menu in no particular order for future-proofing education. This is where I think our energies, our priorities should go. And if your Minister of Education was here, I'm sure that she would say, we're already focused on systems, focusing on this. But I would underline the green box. Let's do this with the primacy of connection. Let's do this in a human way, not a technological way. Technology is just a tool. You can never, ever replace the teacher. And I once sat on a lecture with someone who argued against that notion and was convinced that technology would ultimately replace the teacher. It wasn't a very easy conversation to have, but I still hold out that there is no profound learning without fantastic teachers and teachers who understand that human connection. So to bring this to a close then. So if you future-proof education, you're asking the question, what is we need to go back to the fundamental issue of, well, what's the core purpose? What's the core aim of education? And once we know that, and once we prioritize that, how do we support future generations of learners? And I guess the third question then is about what is the safety net that we need in education? How do we ensure that despite whatever happens in the next decades, we can ensure that our education systems remain fit for purpose, whatever the purpose is that we decide. Resiliency, I've heard a lot of people talk about the importance of resiliency, and yes, of course, it is important to be resilient, but I'm not 100% convinced that alone is the answer, because that over time can actually be diminished as the challenges you face become more and more acute. So it isn't just becoming resilient to change and resilient to some of the influences that we see, but it's actually recognizing that this is part of the solution, but not all of it. So to conclude then, I think it's time to reset our priorities as education systems. COVID has given us a short, sharp shock. It's allowed us to think about what matters most in education and who matters most. And it's given us a pause for thought about what our systems are for. And therefore, I think it's time for education systems to really step up to the plate now and say, let's put everything to one side. What's most important right now for our learners in our context? And then once we know that, we're able to future-proof more effectively. I've talked about the importance of equity, and I will again raise this because I think, for me, if I was answering the question, what is education for? It's about success for every child in every setting and breaking down these inequities that prevent young people with talent, with ability, from progressing. We need to shatter those inequities, as this book clearly says. But ultimately, you know, it comes down to what we value, and most importantly, who we value. I think what COVID-19 has done, it's reminded us about the importance of moral purpose. And actually, a school is a building. Without young people in it, without teachers in it, it's just a building. And learning is much more than about technology. You know, Martin Luther King said, he didn't say I have a strategic plan, he said I have a vision. And I think right now we need to have a very strong vision for the future of education, wherever that education system is in the world. And I wanted to end on this quote that was part of that article that I spoke about earlier. I'm not going to read out the quote, but in a sense, it encapsulates for me in a few sentences what schools have done, what school leaders have done, what school teachers have done to ensure that young people have learned. They've safeguarded the learning of all the young people. And I think that encapsulates for me the importance of every child in every setting. So education is what and who you value. And it's easy to say, but it's really hard to answer. You know, the answer, I don't think, to who you value or what you value is going to be PISA scores. I just don't think that's going to be it anymore. I may be wrong. But I think it's going to be much more about that moral purpose. And right now we can't do everything. So we have to do what we fundamentally value. We have to nail our colours to that mast and say, this is what's most important. This is what we're going to do. And this is who we're going to do it for. And I guess this is where I end the talk. And I think this is such a profound statement that the world is now about sharing and not dividing. We can only future-proof education from learning from each other and recognizing that we're a global education system. So sharing, not dividing, has to be the priority going forward. And I think anyone who heard this speech could not be moved by what the president of the IPC had to say, obviously in relation to Ukraine, but more generally about the importance of sharing and not dividing. Thank you.
Professor Harris, quite a thought-provoking presentation, and you have highlighted quite informative as well, because you have highlighted some of the challenges and opportunities, how higher school practices have changed during COVID. Moving forward, and what are the priorities, and can we future-proof? We are moving on to the question and answer session, and this session will be moderated by Dr. James, who is a member of the Open Lectures Committee and Deputy Dean of Graduate Studies and Research of the Faculty of Humanities and Education. You may place your question in the chat. Dr. James.
Thank you, Professor Badri. And what an extremely inspiring, exciting, motivating afternoon for those of us who are here in the Caribbean, and exciting evening for those of you who are somewhere in Europe or where you are further ahead in the day than us here in Trinidad and Tobago. I really want to thank Professor Harris for that very, very well thought out and very well discussed lecture. It was more like a talk, as she said, and I liked the way that it had the reach for anyone, regardless of station, regardless of position. It spoke to really the values that we should have. Now, I have a few questions to start with. And of course, Professor Harris answered the first question. Do you believe that inevitably education systems will have to adapt to a hybrid blended learning approach in the future? And why? That's the first question I had here to ask Professor Harris. And she did answer that in the in her presentation. So as such, I'll go on to the second question, which is, what do teacher educators need to do in order to prepare and ensure that teachers are equipped to deliver the curriculum in the future? What do teacher educators need to do in order to prepare and ensure that teachers are equipped to deliver the curriculum in the future? Professor Harris.
Thanks, Freddie. That's a good question and quite a challenging one. I think it comes down to the importance of teacher educators focusing on the right things, not the latest things. I think the issue with technology is that we could get swamped with a lot of technological solutions to everything in education quite quickly. And of course, there is a commercial side to that. And I think we've got to be very cautious about what we bring in to teacher education. And I think recognizing the importance of teacher education as being about the teacher. So it comes back to my point about the human connection. But clearly what we need to do to prepare our teachers now is to really get them to think about crisis management and the possibility that schooling may be disrupted in the future. And therefore, we need to learn about what that might look like, how we might feel about it, how they might cope with it, and being resilient to that. So I think we're looking at a different form of teacher education that really does future-proof education insofar that it prepares teachers to think about that possibility. But it comes back to my final point really is, and Andy Hargreaves and Michael Fullen wrote a brilliant book called What's Worth Fighting For Out There? What's Worth Fighting For Out There? And I think that's at the heart of what teacher education should be about, is what's worth fighting for? Or what will we go to the wire for? And the answer to that question should be, we will go to the wire for our students, and we'll go to the wire for the young people in school. And we'll ensure that our curriculum is appropriate and rich enough to get us to that point.
Thank you very much for that response. And I'm going to move straight into another question, which Professor Harris answered in her presentation. But I will just note the question. What leadership preparation is required to ensure leaders are equipped and capable to lead in the next phase of education? Perhaps, Professor Harris, you might want to touch a little bit on what might be that next phase. Is there a phase at all? Can we predict a phase? Or do we have to throw that box out?
You keep on asking me hard questions. I mean, my response to that is, I think the leadership that we need is not the leadership that we've had. And I think the idea that there's an age and stage of leadership, and you have to be a certain age and a certain stage of your career, and then you're promoted to be a leader, because education systems, including universities, are very hierarchical. But I think what we've learned during COVID, and I don't know who said this, but I wish I'd said it, and this is quite a profound point actually, and answers your question directly. And that is that isolation is the enemy of improvement. Isolation is the enemy of improvement. If we've learned anything, the isolated leader is unable to do as much as the leader who is connected, either networked or face-to-face, who is collaborative, who is learning from other leaders. So I think the leadership space in the future is going to be far more distributed. That doesn't mean we don't have formal leaders and vice chancellors and all that, or you're a dean, I think, Freddie. We need those people in the organization. But I think we also need fluidity around leadership, where many leaders, not just a few, are concentrating on solving those problems. So often I answer that question by saying, so what's the biggest problem facing your school or your university right now? And who is best placed to help you solve the problem? And the point is that the person who's best placed to help you solve the problem may not be that person sitting in that leadership role. So I think we need leadership with humility and recognizing that leadership is ultimately just influence, and everybody has influence. But the pandemic has taught us that collaborative influence is much more powerful than individual influence. So I think collaboratively, in a networked way, and my colleague Cecilia Azorin, who I think is on the call, has written quite a lot about network leadership, and we've experienced it. That's the way we've coped. Hybrid schools, hybrid learning is all about distribution of learning and distribution of leadership. So I think we're moving into a different phase of leadership, which is way more collaborative, collective, and impactful.
Thank you very much for that response. Quite a thorough response. And it's sort of answered part of the next question that I had to pose to you, which is, how do leaders in a secondary school bridge or prepare for leading in this new environment? And how, the second part of that question is, how do you prepare students for bridging the gap and working in a hybrid system in Trinidad and Tobago?
You keep on asking me hard questions, and I don't have easy answers to those. But I mean, one of the things that I think that has happened during COVID times is, I think the school has been a bit demystified for students. I think they've understood some of the challenges. They've understood some of the reasons for the introduction of technology. They've understood the challenges their teachers have faced, I think, a lot more. I think all we can do as educators is to be really honest with students. We haven't got the grand plan, we haven't got a solution, we haven't got a blueprint. But if we have their best interests at heart, and we're really clear about that, and I think the best thing we can do to prepare students for hybrid learning is to focus on their well-being and to ensure that they're prepared to learn. That's the most important thing. And then to introduce them to the complexities of hybrid learning. It isn't easy, right? And we're literally walking the path as we're beating it. This is what we're doing in education right now. But we're doing it in exciting and innovative ways. And I think preparing students for bridging the gap is to simply be honest, but also to be inclusive. It is perfectly possible that those young people who are way more savvy with technology than I'll ever be might just have some ideas about ways in which their learning might improve in a hybrid situation. So I would really listen to student voice, get their feedback and learn from that feedback, because ultimately, they are the customer. This is what matters most. So let's see what ideas they have. And I think we'd be really surprised at what they might tell us.
Thank you. I am really happy that we have this time for all these questions, and because this conversation is really getting very deep and is really getting to the heart of what is important in education and what is important to developing people and human development, period. The next question goes more specifically into the technology. And Professor Harris, someone asks, do you think that with the hybrid approach, will it be 50-50 using the technology as a or will it be 50-50, or will it be using the technology as a subset for flipped classroom and having the real teaching being face-to-face? Very interesting question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And in some respects, we're getting a bit preoccupied with proportionality, right? 50-50, 40-60. Well, I think when you're a teacher educator, you come back to, well, what's the learning objectives here, and how is it best to teach that student or to engage with that student to reach the learning objectives? And that might be 40-60. It'll depend on the context of the learning. But I think, the one thing we've got to be really clear about is wherever the technology we bring into our classrooms, it can never replace the teacher, I've said that, but also it's got to add some value to the learning environment. It can't just be another piece of software or another piece of kit. If you think about it, you wouldn't bring a new book or a new reference into your teaching unless it added some value. So why would you do that with technology? That is the same teaching is exactly the same in a hybrid situation where you're making judgments about how young people can learn best. So I think that, you know, we recognize technology as a tool. We recognize the proportionality is not as important as what students should be learning. And the teacher is the expert in making those judgment calls. I mean, if we were to say it has to be 50-50, well, when we assessed the students and we found out that actually 50% of learning online wasn't that effective, would we keep doing it? The answer is categorically no. You know, those people who are expert teachers reflect on their practice and they take feedback from students. So it's no different in a hybrid situation. Good learning is good learning, good teaching is good teaching. It's just we've got a slightly different environment and a different mix of resources. But flipped learning, I think, is such a powerful way of combining those two things. But at the heart of flipped learning, of course, is the face-to-face engagement of the student and the teacher.
Thank you very much for that. This question now comes from Joanne Paul. I believe this is Dr. Joanne Paul, who is into medicine. She asks, Professor Harris, do you think with the hybrid approach, oh, that question, sorry, that was from Joanne Paul. This question comes from Dr. Vimala Kamaluddin. And she asks, or she says, Professor Harris, I am privileged to be part of this conversation. My student teachers stay quiet then and quiet now. The case of they say quiet then and quiet now. They're saying this of their own students. The case of low student engagement online and in person. What would be your advice to these teachers in Trinidad and Tobago? So the questioner is asking really, what can be done to encourage greater student engagement, whether it's online or in person? And this comes from Dr. Vimala Kamaluddin.
Again, it's a great question. And I've experienced this myself teaching undergraduates, which is a bit demoralizing because I just see black boxes on a screen. And despite my best efforts, and despite my ingenuity at things that they might want to talk about or breakout rooms using Zoom, and it's been a challenge, I think. And here's the downside of all of this is the learned behaviors. They've learned very quickly that you don't need to engage because in this sort of environment, it's really hard to walk up to a student and say, okay, Freddie, so what do you think about this? You might do it online, like, hello, Freddie, what do you think about this? But there's no compunction for that student to respond to you. And I've experienced that, okay? And I think that's the downside is some of these learned behaviors. And I think let's be honest, it is to do with screen fatigue. These students have learned quite quickly that there'll be a recording of the lecture, they can switch their camera off, they don't need to answer because they're not in the same room. And that is such a powerful thing. When you're in the same room as your lecturer or teacher, and that person is walking around or chatting to you, you feel a compulsion to say something or to contribute or to get involved in the activities. But when it's like this, it's really hard to do well. And I don't think anyone's solved that problem. But one of the worries is, as we go forward, is that's the learned behavior to not engage rather than to engage.
And Professor Harris, I am just really so happy that you mentioned that point in particular, because there's a sense in which that makes the divide between the haves and the have-nots. It sort of narrows that gap, because what you find happening, and a young man I know very well said that to me, he had that same problem that you outlined. So I'm really glad you talked about it. And his issue wasn't, so it takes away the issue of socioeconomic that we all look to. And it really comes down to personality and really just human beings and how how people respond. The next question, which Sunita Maraj asks, is taken partly from something you said as you presented. She's asking, what advice can you offer to education leaders if they have to shatter the existing education systems that may prevent them from achieving the vision for their school as they try to promote that digital diet? To quote you, I have acknowledged, though, your acknowledgement of collaborative, collective leadership approach. Very interesting one here.
Yeah, so repeat the first part of the question. It was quite a long question, so.
Yes, no problem. What advice can you offer to education leaders if they have to shatter the existing education systems that may prevent them from achieving the vision for their school as they try to promote that digital diet?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure we need to break everything. I don't think we need to break everything down. I think what we need to do is to refocus a little bit. You know, I think we've gone through such trauma and disruption. We need to pause and reflect and say, as I've said already, you know, what's the most important thing that we need to be doing? And if it is about promoting equity, that doesn't mean we break everything down. You know, the book Shattering Inequities was really an account of the glass ceiling and shattering the glass ceiling. That was essentially what that image meant. But I think we don't need to dismantle everything. You know, what's good in education we should keep. And if there's a strong vision in the school that all learners succeed, then that's what you keep. You don't destroy that. But I think what we start to think about very carefully are ways of working. You know, were our previous practices actually good, or could they be better? And I think I'm just thinking about professional learning, and so much professional learning, to be honest, that doesn't change teachers' practice at all. I mean, here, me talking to you like this will not change anything in terms of what you do as a teacher, because it's the wrong medium, okay? What changes teachers' practice is seeing other teachers and working with other teachers in context. So the things that we know work well for our system and for young people, we absolutely keep. But we do, I think, start to question perhaps things like professional learning, where people go out and do a day and come back and they talk about having a nice lunch. I mean, it may not be the same in your context, but there is a whole raft of things that schools have to do and teachers have to do that you do question, because you wonder about the impact of those things and whether the time could be better spent.
Thank you for that. Now, this question comes from the person, someone who is heading the National Parent-Teacher Association in Trinidad and Tobago. It's Zina Ramatali. And her question is, what advice would you give to parents who feel totally insecure and inadequate?
I'll sort of answer that question a different way. Every bit of research evidence we have internationally, okay, shows that if you engage parents, and by parents I mean carers, I mean the whole raft of people who look after children in their different contexts. If you engage parents in the learning of young people, then the evidence would suggest that their attainment and achievement significantly goes up. So parents are such an important part of the whole educational process. They are the first educators, let's be honest. But the point is that they're seen as being often outside the school. And one of the things we know is if you bring parents inside the school, not just for parents' evenings or whatever, but if you really engage them in learning, the learning of the young people in their care, then that learning can dramatically improve. So we need to recognize the power of parents and the contribution that they make, not just to schooling, but the young people's learning. But the second part of that answer is, yeah, I mean, I think parents have felt quite bewildered, quite beleaguered, quite unable sometimes to deal with the challenges of learning that face, their children. So, I mean, I guess we have a job to do in education to build back confidence. And I think I talked about, the well-being of students, staff, and ourselves. Well, we need to build back the confidence of parents, and I think address the well-being issues that may reside there. Ultimately, we are all in the same boat. I've heard that phrase. We're all in the same boat, right? COVID-19 has placed us all in the same boat. Yeah, but we're on different boats, really, of different sizes and different scales. So the contextual responsibility now is to really reach out to those parents, who might see the school as a problem, who might not. But that's the challenge now. If we're really all in this together, then we should be able collectively to connect to each other, because we're all trying to do the very best we can for young people. So I think a degree of commitment to engage parents is really important, not in a superficial way, but in a real way, to collaborate with parents more, to bring them into the school, to connect with them more. And by doing that, I think you raise the confidence of parents that they really have a significant role to play in the education of their children or the young people in their care. Ultimately, the parent is a third teacher, and I think that's the important thing to recognize, that beyond the teacher and beyond the peers in the classroom, the parent, the carer, is the third teacher. So we should engage parents, as this is a really important lever of improvement in most systems.
Right, the questions are really coming fast and furious, Professor Harris, I have to admit. I hope we can get most of them in. This one comes from Ashram Diraj, who says, admittedly, we have lost learning. What would you advise to help the recovery of those students who are in the system now or preparing to leave with this learning gap?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about recovery, we talk about learning loss, and I think we one of the things we have to do during these COVID times is to hold the mirror up and say, what are the real issues here? What are we actually facing? And yes, of course, some young people are far behind where they should have been if COVID hadn't happened, but that doesn't mean that they're not able to catch up. It doesn't mean they're not able to progress. So we need, I think, to recognize that young people need, specific support and help to get them back on track, to get them moving again. But we have to also recognize that that's going to take a little bit of time, because we've just lost 2 years. Some young people, it's been 2 years. For some people, it's been a year. Some people, it's been a few months, depending on their circumstance. So I think we need to put in place the resources and the help and the support that these young people need. But I still come back to the point, unless we address the issue of well-being and mental health in young people because of COVID, we're not going to move them forward in their learning. So a double-pronged approach. Let's address the well-being issue, because with good well-being comes good learning. And let's put in place the support measures, and let's not try and force the system to recover. It needs time. Just as it took 2 years for COVID to happen, it might take a year, 2 years. But these young people will get into universities, these young people will get into workplaces. But we need not to judge them in the way that we judged students 2 years ago, because that is a bit brutal, really. We need to be a bit kinder in our systems and recognize that these young people need the time, the help, the support, not indefinitely, because we can't give them definite, period of time, but that specialist support around their mental health, well-being, and their learning, I think is now critically important to get them back on track. And we can, and we are doing that. And schools have done an amazing job, and they're continuing to do an amazing job all around the world.
Thank you. This question comes or relates to a stakeholder in education, the teacher unions. And Damian Gopi I think, really wants to know what is their role for the teacher unions in helping to establish the future proofing of the education system, and what might that role look like?
Yeah, I mean, all stakeholders play a critical role in the ecosystem of our education systems, and unions play a particularly important role because they safeguard teachers, they safeguard their professional time, they safeguard their professional conditions. And I think one of the things that unions can do in partnership with teachers and schools and schooling is just to recognize that the wrong way to go is to ask more and more of teachers. And I think we need to recognize that teachers can do some things, but they can't do everything. And therefore, to put additional pressure on teachers to do the catch-ups, to make sure that children are getting through examinations. They've been through COVID too. So I think the unions are there as I think a conscience in a way, and also a protective blanket, so that the teachers are not pushed to the nth degree. Now, here's the thing that worries me. Around the world, we are seeing, including in Wales and England, we are seeing leaders and teachers leaving the profession, good teachers, good leaders leaving the profession because they've just been overwhelmed, they're tired, they're exhausted, and what we need to do now is not put more pressure on the system because we're going to lose more good teachers and good leaders. So the unions, in a way, in my view, it may not be everybody's view, I think are there to ensure that that pressure doesn't become so damaging that we lose the best asset that we have, which are our school leaders and our school teachers.
Thank you very much. And at this point, I think we're coming to the last question. I know there are some more questions in, but we just wouldn't be able to answer them at this particular point in time.
Can I just say that, sorry, Freddie.
No problem.
I'm like your supervisor interrupting you again. If people do want to email me, I think my email address was on the last slide, and they can find me at Swansea. So I'm going to encourage people, if they haven't had their questions answered and they want to make contact, I'm more than happy to answer.
And we can put that email address in the chat so that people can have access to it. Thank you very much, Professor Harris.
Absolutely.
The last question comes from Ronald. The last question that we will ask comes from Dr. Lee Piggott. And she says, thank you so much, Prof. Harris, for a brilliant lecture and insightful responses to our questions. My question is, how do you think we might encourage governments to truly prioritize equity in education so that all children can experience success? And I think this question will bring a fitting end to this segment.
I think that's a brilliant question. And I think the one thing the pandemic has done is it's allowed countries and systems to look at other systems and to learn from other systems, because we were all facing the same sort of challenges. So I think that's been a very positive thing. But I think as we go forward, I think that systems can learn from other systems, not to borrow from other systems. I don't think that works. It just, the evidence would show that borrowing things from one context and superimposing it in another doesn't necessarily work. So you need, in a way, instead of policy borrowing, you need to borrow some practices. But ultimately, I think systems around the world, just like schools around the world, should be able to hold each other to account. And let's be honest, if the priority isn't equity and excellence in education, then tell me what it is.
And on that note, I am going to close this question and answer segment and go straight into our closing remarks. I mean, in this short space of time, we've had so much come out. We've had so much rich discussion. I think we will all leave here quite full and just able to take a nice cup of tea at the end of the evening. But before we do that, I just want to thank some persons. I will start with the Honorable Dr. Nyan Gatsby-Dolly, Minister of Education, Trinidad and Tobago. for her moving opening remarks. Our distinguished lecturer, Professor Alma Harris, for her inspiring words and wisdom. Our principal and pro-vice chancellor, our deputy principal, our deans, and other senior administrative staff of the St. Augustine campus of the UWI, all staff and students of the various universities in the Caribbean, colleagues, friends, and family of Professor Harris, specially invited guests who joined us from local, regional, and international communities, staff, management, and students of the various educational organizations and parent organizations, secondary schools, primary schools, early childhood care and education, invited guests, our general public, media, members of the Open Lectures Committee of the St. Augustine Campus, led by our esteemed Professor Badri, and all those who made this an enlightening event and made it an inspiring event. I thank you. And before we leave, I would like to extend an invitation to you all for our upcoming professorial lecture by Professor Duraisamy Saranvana Kumar of the Department of Food Production in the Faculty of Food and Agriculture. This takes place on Thursday, 26 May, 2022 at 6 p.m. So put it in your diaries. It's Thursday, May 2022, Thursday, 26 May, 2022 at 6 p.m. And his topic is microbes, a devil or savior of plant health. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending and participating. And join us for our next lecture. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful music that we're leaving to and the wonderful music that we started off with. Bye, everybody.